Stan, watch what you say when you open your mic. And with that, I'm going to introduce Mr. Richard Pacheco, Director of Health and Safety at UPS Red River District. That's all of Texas and Oklahoma. I'm privileged to not only get to work with Mr. Pacheco, but to call him my friend. I think we're going on 15 years now that we've worked together at UPS. I've learned a lot working with Mr. Pacheco at UPS, and it amazes me. He's responsible for overseeing the health and safety of 42,000 employees on a daily basis. And I've worked with some large companies before, but to see the pressure and what occurs daily with that many employees that you're responsible for is just amazing. And Mr. Pacheco does a fantastic job of that. He's recently received his CSP, but he's working on his master's in industrial organization and psychology at Harvard. And in being Richard's friend, he routinely questions me about philosophies, behavior-based safety, safety in general, and it's fun just on a day-to-day basis getting to work with such a professional. So with that, Richard, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Larry. So first of all, before I get started today, what a distinguished group of individuals you have on today's call. And many of you, I know many of you, and I feel privileged that I've had the opportunity in my 25 years at UPS to engage with some of you either face-to-face or in other types of settings, from our partners over at OSHA to some of our industry partners to some of the Liberty Mutual folks. So I just really want to tell you how much of a privilege I consider today to be able to present something to you that's really deeply rooted in science and psychology. And when we talk about behavior-based safety, and that's really what today's discussion is about, we need to take a step back before we move forward. So before we really move forward, let's take a step back. But before we do that, I typically, and Larry will tell you, and the other folks that I engage in, most of my conversations are always in the form of questions, because when you start asking questions versus stating ideology, you really tend to learn a lot from the audience that you're engaged with or the particular subject that you're working with. And so when I started today's presentation, and I will tell you, Larry and I have been quietly having this discussion ongoing now, seriously, for about 5 years. Now, we've known each other for 15 years. Larry's been a consultant with Liberty Mutual here at UPS. So we are his customer, but our relationship goes beyond the employer-customer relationship. It really goes safety professional to safety professional. And for those of you that are on the call today, we're not Amazonians, we're not UPSers, we're not OSHA folks, we're safety professionals. And what's important is that while I may be responsible for 42,000 employees in my work area, if we were probably to add up all the employees that all of us are responsible for, we'd probably get into the 100+ thousand. So our ability to go out there and influence our work environment really has either a potential positive effect or negative effect. And Victor is spot on. I've worked with Victor before in the past, and I will tell you that OSHA is absolutely on the leading edge when it comes to its research institute and what it is that they've been trying to tell us. The reality is that it's really quite shameful that as safety professionals, we have not been able to reshuffle the top 10, so to speak. And knowing that slips and falls continues to remain at the top of the list, and you heard Victor talk accurately about the fact that same level falls are just as tragic as multi-level falls. But the question really boils down to why. If we spend as much time and effort in our research and developing our safety programs to address that particular root cause or that leading indicator, why hasn't it changed? Well, it may not necessarily be that your program's wrong, and I doubt that it is, and it may not necessarily be that the mechanics of your training is wrong, and I doubt that that is too. It really boils down to something much deeper, and that's a person's ideology. And ideology in the context of safety really has to do with a person's mindset. What do they believe at their core? And whatever it is that they believe at their core, how do you move them from at-risk type of behavior or ideologies to safe behaviors and safe ideologies? So I put this slide up here for a reason. As a safety professional, any one of us were on the construction side or in the manufacturing facility or anywhere, and we were to see a behavior like this, most of us would be instantaneously prompt to say something or do something about it. And temporarily, that individual may or may not lift the object correctly, and that would be good if they change their behavior. But the real question is how do I change that person systemically that moving forward for the rest of their life, that they're always going to approach the object correctly and perform the proper mechanical lift? How do you do that? Larry, the next slide. So as Larry prompts this next slide, today's talk is really, it's an analytical approach to behavior conditioning and employee engagement. And what we're going to really talk about is we're going to use the cutting edge technology and sciences that are out there through empirical studies. So everything is going to be science-based. But before we get there, we're going to spend a quick minute and we're going to talk about behavior-based safety and really its origins. And if you don't know, behavior-based safety really has its origins or its history in behaviorism. So Larry, let's go ahead and prompt up the next slide. And so if you were to go back and take a look, 1920s, 1930s, 40s, and 50s, where did this behavior-based safety evolve from? How did it get to where we are today? And for those folks that use behavior-based safety in your safety systems or your programs, maybe you don't know where it came from and what it was really intended to do. And so when you see these names right here, and there's many more, by the way, that are out there that also have really important contributions to behaviorism. But I selected these four because for those folks that have been through any academic setting or been to any workshops, these names tend to really pop up, and specifically the last three. You talk about Pavlov, Henrich, and Maslow, but before we get to those folks, we need to talk about Skinner. So let's go ahead and move over to the next slide. So Skinner's contribution to behavior-based safety really has to do, Larry, if you don't mind, if you could advance the slide, please. So B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner, one back, please. So B.F. Skinner, he was with us from 1904 to 1990. He was a Harvard professor. He was a psychologist. Larry, one more back. There you go. And really, his claim to fame had to do with these 4 bullet points that you see right there. So he was known really as the father of operant conditioning. And this is sometimes referred to as instrumental conditioning. And this is a method of learning that employs the rewards and punishments with regards to behavior. Through operant conditioning, an association is made between a behavior and a consequence. Remember, consequence can either be negative or positive for a particular behavior. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the consequences of a response determine the probability of that action being repeated or not being repeated. Through operant conditioning, behavior is reinforced or rewarded will likely be repeated. The behavior which is punished, and I use that word loosely, will typically occur less frequently. Skinner, like I said, was regarded as the father of operant conditioning, but his work was based on an individual by the name of Thorndike, and Thorndike was known for the law of effect. So according to this principle, behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences is likely to be repeated, and behavior followed by unpleasant consequences is less likely to be repeated. Skinner introduced this new term into the law of effect, reinforcement. Then reinforcement is a behavior which is reinforced tends to be repeated or strengthened. Behavior which is not reinforced tends to die out or be extinguished, so it's weakened. So Skinner identified 3 types of responses or operant responses that can follow behavior. Neutral operants. So these are responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Reinforcers. Responses from the environment that increase the probability of a behavior being repeated. Reinforcers can be either positive or negative. Punishers, responses from the environment that decrease the likelihood of behavior being repeated. Punishment weakens behavior. We can all think of examples of how our own behavior has been affected by reinforcers or punishers. As a child, you probably remember trying out a number of behaviors and learned very quickly from your parents what was acceptable and not acceptable. And those lessons probably stayed with you for the rest of your life. Larry, next slide. So now let's move on to Mr. Pavlov. Most of us know him already. So he was with us from 1849 to 1936, and he's a Nobel Prize winner. And his claim to fame was classical conditioning. And he really talked about temperance and involuntary reflex action, and most importantly, learning theory. So classical conditioning focuses on using preceding conditions to alter behavioral reactions. The principles underlying classical conditioning have influenced many antecedent control strategies used in the classroom. So in other words, learning theory. Classical conditioning sets the groundwork for present-day behavior modification practices, such as antecedent control. Now, any of us that are associated with behavior-based safety, we all heard the term the ABCs. That's your antecedent, your behavior, and of course the consequence, negative or positive. Antecedent events and conditions are defined as conditions occurring before the behavior. Pavlov's early experiments used manipulation of events or stimuli preceding a behavior, for example, like a tone, to produce, like, for example, salivation in dogs, much like teachers manipulate instruction and learning environments to produce positive behaviors and decrease maladaptive behaviors. Although he didn't refer to the tones as an antecedent, Pavlov was one of the first scientists to demonstrate the relationship between environmental stimuli and behavioral responses. He systematically presented and withdrew stimuli to determine the antecedents that were eliciting particular responses, which is similar to the ways in which educational professionals today conduct functional behavior modification assessments. Antecedent strategies are supported by empirical evidence to support implicitly within classroom environments. So antecedent-based interventions are supported by research to be preventative and to produce immediate reductions in problem behaviors. Larry? So now let's move on to one that a lot of us have spent a lot of time learning, and that's Mr. Hendrick's Law. So his claim to fame is his book, The Industrial Accident Prevention, A Scientific Approach. And his most famous quote that a lot of us have learned in school: in the workplace, for every accident that causes a major injury, there are 29 accidents that cause minor injuries and 300 accidents that cause no injuries. He was an assistant superintendent of engineering and inspection at the Travelers Insurance Company. And when he published his book in 1931, one of his empirical findings from his book became known as Hendrick's Law, and we just read that above, and that's the workplace. For every major, there's 29 accidents that cause minor and 300 that have no events. Now, in the modern era, with big data and the ability to do further research, we know that those numbers don't necessarily carry through. However, the premise is correct. We know that for particular behaviors that go uncorrected, they eventually lead to workplace events, which eventually lead to serious types of injuries that require medical or reporting, and eventually it leads to serious injury or fatality. So in his book, he really put forward the following concept known as Hendrick's Law, and that's something that most of us are aware of. However, this is where, at this point, there was some criticism associated with this type of work, mainly in the sense that when you read the rest of his book, he really focused on man failures, and that's a quote. But what the criticism was, and it's correct, by the way, all the emphasis was placed on the employee rather than the entire system. As a management team, we are part of the system. And he had some pretty big critics. One of the most notable, of course, was Deming. And for those of us that have any sort of academic background in professional safety, we know how important Deming was. For example, the Deming cycle, and how his work really led to concepts, for example, like the lean system, where we really had an opportunity to identify defects, focus on them, and develop safety systems that really improved efficiencies, but not at the expense of the employee. So while he's not credited for necessarily the near-miss safety prevention, clearly his work implied the importance of managing near misses as he attempted to quantify workplace assumptions. And again, he has his scale. By trade and by nature, he was an engineer and a loss control prevention expert. But he was more analytical, and he was tended to be black and white, and really didn't spend a lot of time focusing on employee ideology and management-driven culture. Larry? Then we get into Maslow. And the reason why, if you've ever wondered why Maslow was so important to safety, Maslow really kind of moves behaviorism in another direction. So Maslow's claim to fame is, obviously we know about the infamous pyramid, his 5 levels of self-actualization, and how work alludes to motivation and drives. So he was really a human needs person, and he ordered human needs in a particular hierarchy. Now, the hierarchy came later on when it came to the book, or the pyramid. However, when he published his original work in 1943, again, it was really more about the needs people have and how they needed to dispose lower-level needs before they can start reaching self-actualization. Now, in professional safety, specifically as leaders, that's exactly what we want to drive our employees to. We want them to actualize and recognize what behaviors are safe and lead to positive outcomes, and what behaviors are incorrect and could potentially lead to serious injury-related outcomes. So when we talked about those things, his work was really important. So according to Maslow's theory, when the human being tends to ascend levels of hierarchy, they really start moving towards self-actualization. And later on in life, he really started to develop what's now called meta-motivation, which really describes the self-actualization process that people go through, and all people go through that. Typically, if you look back where you were in your 20s and your mindset versus where you may be now, you can see that this natural process occurs. Experience, either through positive learning, through negative learning, really moves us towards being what's called a B creativity or a D creativity. So the B's, that's the being creativity or self-actualization. And the D's are the deficient creativity, where really we don't learn anything or we don't move forward. Larry? So that's a very brief psychological and empirically supported explanation for what we're really going to move into next. Behavior-based safety is really based on extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation is defined by incentives, reinforcers, consequences, but the question is, does it really work? For those of us that have been in the behavior safety environment for more than a couple of years, and you don't really notice improvements in workplace culture, specifically when it comes to top-line numbers of frequencies and reportables, you have to ask yourself, if I'm doing all these things correctly, why isn't it moving? So earlier we talked about Skinner and his work with operant conditioning. And operant conditioning refers to a process by which a person learns how to operate effectively in the environment. Operating effectively means learning to engage behaviors that produce attractive consequences, approval, money, recognition, reward, while learning not to engage in behaviors that produce adverse consequences, criticism, rejection, or any of those things that are not considered positive. Incentives always precede behaviors, and they're simultaneously cued. There are positive incentives, such as smiles, positive aromas, groups of friends gathered having good conversation. Negative incentives, a grimace, a spoiled smell, an envelope that looks like junk mail. Through experience, we learn to be prepared to move towards or away based on the cue that we received, which we just spoke about. It's a process where we're learning or being conditioned. This process later shapes goal-directed behavior, which is another conversation all by itself. Because positive incentives tend to cue approach behavior, while negative incentives tend to cue avoidance behavior. It may be a little confusing, and it may appear to be confounding with what constitutes an incentive and what constitutes a consequence. But both are external events. In other words, as the employer, we're either in a command and control situation. We're either going to recognize positive behaviors or we're going to we're going to apply negatives to other behaviors that we don't like. So when we really take a look at that, that's important. So how do you define some of these things? So defining a reinforcer is easy. It's any environmental object or event that increases the behavior. If someone smiles while you're talking to them, or you have a steady stream of positive, then you tend to keep talking. You keep engaging in the conversation. From a theoretical point of view, the definition is a little more difficult. In theory, a reinforcer must be defined in a manner that is independent from its effects on behavior. Consequences and rewards are really two sides of the same coin. This aspect of extrinsic motivation is commonly practiced and in most cases beneficial in the command and control environments where precision and lethal consequences are more prevalent. Legacy companies with very structured, top-down, layered bureaucratic management styles are really kind of known for their reward, punishment, or their command and control work environments. However, studies and empirical data clearly and without a doubt show that positive behaviors and therefore outcomes decline shortly after rewards have been received. Now, I want to put a side note on that. Reward is typically misused or misapplied in the work setting. When rewards become systematic, when they become scheduled, and they're administered with little or no personal impact, the studies show that after a given amount of time, they tend to have the opposite effect. And employees come to expect reward for positive, or what they consider positive behavior. And failure to continue to provide the award tends to actually add some angst to the employee, and at that point they move away towards positive. Now, rewards given appropriately with the appropriate feedback in an unscheduled or surprise type of manner tends to elicit the exact opposite. It tends to reinforce the behavior, thereby both operatively and conditionally creating an environment where employees want to move towards that behavior because they understand that they'll be recognized for positive behaviors. So let's move on a little bit and talk about contemporary BBS, behavior-based safety. Now, there are many positives associated with contemporary BBS. Number one, it's easy to employ. Your parameters are flexible. So what applies in the construction field can clearly be used for just construction versus what goes on in steel, versus what goes on in manufacturing, versus what goes on in transportation. Larry, you can move the slide. So the other major advantage of behavior-based safety, it's not just a management program. With some small training, you can get your non-management workforce to participate and conduct peer-to-peer behavior-based safety observations along with a strong supportive management team. And most importantly, it's non-disciplinary in nature. The feedback that's given is really designed to be personal, it's designed to be immediate, and without a formal setting of consequence, because the last thing you ever want to do, unless you're absolutely forced to, is go towards formal discipline where employees think that their employment could be at risk. However, there are some pitfalls. So Larry, let's move over to the next one. So if you use BBS or behavior-based safety as your marquee item in your safety program, there tends to be some defects associated with that. The data tends to be qualitative in nature. So for those folks that are conducting observations before the feedback, my interpretation of a proper lift may be different than Larry's interpretation of a proper lift. So it lacks continuity from observer to observer. Another major pitfall is that there is very little training associated for the observers. What exactly do you want them to be able to observe, and will they be able to observe that correctly? So identifying true at-risk behaviors is another item. Feedback, the ability to profile an individual or the environment and give them the feedback that's most appropriate. There tends to be no association with antecedent behavior. Did the employee have a bad day? Has the employee had some production issues or service issues? Are there issues going on outside of the work environment? Really, there's very little associated with antecedent behavior. Unfortunately, many companies tend to operationalize BBS and turn it into a punishment slash consequences program. I saw you doing X activity wrong. Here's your formal discipline or whatever is appropriate for your industry associated with that. And there tends to be, the studies show that when BBS is initially rolled out, most management have a very high level of engagement. However, as the programs tend to lag on, management tends to not support BBS the way that they initially supported. In the coal mine study, and for those of you that like to look up studies, in the coal mine study, we saw this exact type of response. In the beginning of this multi-year study, it was longitudinal in nature, they saw significant improvement with regards to the reduction of reported injuries, unfortunately, which is the top-end matrix for whether or not you have positive results from that. However, there's a lot of noise. For those of us that have been in the industry for a while, we know we have to guard against muscling of reporting. In other words, is there a barrier to employees reporting workplace events, specifically at the inception of BBS? Now, as time tends to wear on, what we typically see is that management walks away from that or doesn't support it the way that it initially does, and it's typically left as an employee-only program. So these next couple of slides, I want to give you some examples of real-world feedback from a real-world industry, mine. And so these are going to be examples from an observation form, and there's going to be two of them. So Larry, if you could go to the next slide, please. So feedback. So what we're looking at here, and there's a lot of noise, and I apologize for that. What you don't see were the very particular behaviors that our observers were trained to look at. This was a blended one for a professional driver, so there was some slips and falls, lifting and lowering, and some driving behaviors that we asked our management teams to take a look at, and or our peer observers. And so you can see that there were some of the reviews that were commented. INT 18 talks about intersections. So for a UPS driver, they're trained in the Smith system of driving. And what that means is that when they approach an intersection, we always teach them to be prepared to stop before they actually enter the intersection. They would take their foot off the accelerator, hover over the brake. They would, before they get there, they would make a point of decision. In other words, if that light were to turn or an object were to come in that intersection, am I prepared to stop? We train them to stop on the other side of that line, that crosswalk line. So this particular observer says that this was an issue, and he listed it there. Always stop at or before the stop line first, then clear the intersection. LRL means left, look, left, right, left. Ease up if your view of traffic is obstructed. That was the feedback. SS 15. So to take a look at that, continue to communicate in traffic using horn lights and signals so others around you know what your intersections are, or your intentions are. And then B4, continue using your horn prior to and during backing events to convey that you're moving and communicating with others in the picture. So if you take a look at it, it's pretty generic. And if you're an employee receiving this feedback, where's the incentive to either improve or do nothing? Nothing here really provides you the type of feedback or coaching that is needed in order for somebody to understand the importance of why these behaviors were identified and what really needs to happen moving forward. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So in other words, the employee here during this observation just got a report back on what was done wrong with no clue or indication of what they need to do to correct the behavior. Larry, the next one, please. So as Larry preps this one here, you're going to take a little bit different view, and also you're going to see, again, real-world examples. So here you can see a picture was applied to this. This is what the observer saw. And if you can really zero in on it, and you can't, Larry, and I don't expect you to, but what you're seeing is that a driver is pulling the dolly behind them. So Shalane's on this call. She'll tell you right there that that employee has an at-risk behavior associated with the shoulder, which in our industry tends to be a higher level loss item because we want our drivers to push their dollies rather than to pull their dollies. But here's the feedback that was given. This individual used the handrail while entering and exiting the vehicle, used the hazards at each stop, used a carry aid to deliver multiple packages. The driver did not use twos, ands, lowering dolly, bend at waist of knees. That's what we told the driver. So again, I would ask you, if we're providing feedback and we want to change behavior, not only did we not offer anything that would stimulate the driver to move in a positive direction and behavior change, it's just a report. And that's really where we want to move into the next series of conversations. Larry, let's look at one more. Okay, so here, right here, when you take a look at this one, again, nice driver. Now, this driver's got some thumbs up action going on. You can see, where's Victor? Victor, look, Victor, he's wearing his mask, so, we're compliant, doing a good job there. And as you can see, Douglas over here did a very good job focusing on his next stop. He's behind the line, signal on in advance, and turning at the appropriate time and speed. He's very cautious with COVID and wears his mask in public areas, even in neighborhoods. Now, there's some incentive right there. We learned earlier that when you associate certain positive aspects to a feedback, it tends to reinforce what we're trying to do. And this is a good example of that. Douglas did a very good job focusing on his next stop. So if I were to go look at Douglas next time randomly and didn't tell Douglas we're on the way out there, statistically and empirically, the odds are, because of the positive reinforcer, Douglas may indeed change his behavior or continue with the behavior that moves in the direction that we want Douglas to do. So I gave you 3 examples right there. And really, if you take a look at those examples, what we're talking about is motivational feedback. In other words, we're touching people deeply and ideologically, at least in the example, but not so much in the first 2 examples. So in the modern era, there's new science that says that to move beyond behavior modification, we really need to start looking at what makes people tick. And how do you address those particular people? Well, Larry, let's move on to the next slide. So the most current and accurately accepted data or philosophy associated with motivation is exactly on feedback. It's not necessarily what you see, but how you communicate what you're seeing. And that's really important. So Dr. David Forbes, who's the writer of this book called The Science of Why, and his research is based on that, is really the most leading authority on changing people's behavior. And here, let me give you a little bit of background on Dr. Forbes. So Dr. Forbes actually does not work in the academic setting. He does have an academic background. Obviously, he's floated around some pretty big institutions, and he's worked with some of the industry heavy hitters, for example, like Jack Demick, Cy Wapner, and these folks are the leading psychologists, clinical psychologists, in what's called person and environment. And what that means is this. Remember Skinner's work. Remember those other folks where we talked about how the environment cues us to do certain things without even speaking about it. So these folks have taken that original foundational work and moved it forward. And so what Dr. Forbes is known for is really how to dig deep and get to inside a person and figure out what makes them tick. And there's 9 of them. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. So he's really boiled down 3 categories. And inside those 3 categories, there's 3 particular drives. And drive's another word for motivation. These are how people are built. And when you hear some of these, you may see some of this in yourself. So expectation. And these are people that are planning for the future. They're security-driven, they're empowerment and belonging. And they tend to move towards belonging. Experiences. These are people that tend to live in the moment. They have a lot of movement towards identity, engagement, and nurturance. And there's those other folks that are more outcome-driven, and they learn from the past to build on the future. And these are the folks that like to be associated with mastery, achievement, and esteem. So as we talk a little bit about that, let me kind of lay that out for you. Larry, let's go to the next slide real quick. So as we talked about now, we know we really want to focus on feedback. So when delivering feedback, the observer would be best served to appeal to an individual's inner drive. Deep down, every individual has an inner ideology, whether they realize it or not. That's what makes them tick. So let's start and talk about the security motive. This is a motive where people tend to move towards safety, and they have confidence. That's what they really want to be driven towards. They want to feel safe in everything they do, and they want to be confident in what they do. And they tend to move away towards feelings of insecurity or feelings of being afraid. Have you ever met the person who says, I got to do it this way because if I don't, I can get in trouble or bad things can happen. I have to wear my seatbelt because if I get in a crash, something really bad can happen to me. Empowerment. It's the motive that moves towards freedom and power and tends to move away towards feelings of being trapped or frustrated. Feelings of freedom. They don't like to be told what to do so much. They want to feel like they're in control. So how you approach them is really important. They don't like feelings of being confined or being frustrated as if no one's listening to them. Belonging is the motive where we tend to move towards feelings of acceptance and belonging, and we tend to move away towards isolation and loneliness. These tend to be the people that volunteer for safety committees. They volunteer for extra activities. They want to feel like they're part of the team. They're moving the ball forward. To isolate them is the greatest torture you can apply towards them. Nope, you can't be on this committee. Nope, you're not like everybody else. Identity is the motive that moves towards uniqueness and being interesting, and they tend to move away from the ordinary or the boring. Engagement is the motive that moves towards involvement and becoming absorbed in whatever it is that they do, and they tend to move away towards passiveness and indifference. Nurturance. It's the motive that moves towards sharing and caring and moves away towards selfishness or being uninvolved. Now, the last three, we typically tend to see this in those folks who are considered the alphas or A-type personalities. Mastery. Mastery is the motive that moves towards talent and exceptional behavior and works terribly hard to move away towards incompetence. These are the people that tend to focus on an item just for the sake of being really good at it. Whether they win awards, whether they're the top of their class, it's not as important to them. It's just them knowing that they're the best at what they do. These are the folks that tend to work a little bit longer, do stuff on the weekend, go to workshops and classes. Achievement-oriented people are those that move towards victory or productiveness, and they tend to move away towards defeat and pointless endeavors. Now, I'm going to put a little star on this one. These folks right here, if given the right environment, they can really be assets towards your company. However, if you create the wrong environment, these are the people that tend to take shortcuts and have no problem achieving at the expense of others. Esteem. This is the motive that moves towards a feeling of pride and the perception of respect and moves away from the feelings of ashamedness or being disrespected. So this is an important backdrop, and the reason why I wanted to make sure all of us had an opportunity to see this, Larry, go to the next slide. So the heart of today's discussion really boils down to what we started off with. So Larry, when you get to that picture, it's going to be really important. As the safety professional and leader in your particular areas of responsibility, training your observers to recognize the person's ideological lean, whether they lean towards a particular item or away from, whether they're more mastery associated, whether they're security associated. So if I know that Larry here in this picture tends to be a person that wants to be really known for being really technically sound, the way I provide feedback to Larry would really be associated with those tendencies. I would approach Larry, and rather than just say, Larry, that's a bad lift, don't do that again. If you do that again, you know our safety process, there could be bad consequences. Versus, Larry, I know that you pride yourself in your work. I know that you work really hard to make sure that everything is done correctly. So let me go back and spend a minute talking to you about these last couple of lifts that I saw. What I'm seeing here is that you're not bending at the knees. You're not placing that package in your power zone and lifting in a manner where it's under control. People that are really good at lifts master those particular mechanics. Now, I know that's something that you want to do. Would you agree or disagree? Now, it doesn't always work out perfect like that, but understanding how Larry is really the most important. That's the magic in the feedback. And through persistent and consistent observation with the right type of feedback, empirically speaking, statistically speaking, the odds are that Larry's going to start performing the lift that you see on the right side of the screen. Okay, that's a lot of theory. Let me show you a couple of real-world examples. Next slide, Larry. It's coming. So what you're getting ready to see here in these next couple of slides, and I use some data that's in-house, what you see right here is our version of behavior-based safety and really the data output. So I want to take your eyes right there to, Larry, if you've got your laser pointer, if you can go to the green line under the mesquite division. So what you're looking at here is 7 weeks worth of data. And from left to right, it's really not that complicated. The number of forms or observations we completed, the number of employees that the observations were conducted on, what we considered total safe behaviors, total at-risk behaviors, the total number of observations done, what we consider percent safe, the total number of appreciative feedback given, the total number of constructive feedback, the total number of feedback in itself. Now, when you jump over to your days away restricted or transferred, your auto crash, what you're going to see right there are just raw number totals, no frequencies associated. So when you start applying some statistical, and I ran an ANCOVA right here, and you start running some statistical data, what you see on average, this particular division does about 100, give or take, forms. They touch about 163 employees a week, and as you can see, the output is they average 2 recordable injuries and 3 crashes or 5 total defects a week. Now, the most recent week completed, all the way at the top, Larry, right there, you can see that they matched their average, about 100 forms. They're a little bit below their average at 141 employees observed, and if you look at their total feedback, which I highlighted in red, their feedback numbers were much lower than normal. Well, the data holds true. If you look at their average versus their actual, it was spot on, 2 recordable injuries and 3 crashes. Now, let's go down to the bottom metrics. Same thing. If you look at the average, this particular division does about 230 forms, about 402 employees, and you can read the rest of the data. Now, what you typically see over here is a 2 and 1. So in this particular case, if you take a look at it, now I chose to use 2 not positive ones, but you can see when they were below their average, their defects increased. Now I didn't put the one on here, and we went through this a little while ago with another presentation. There's another division that we measured that showed to be above their averages. And guess what? Statistically, it had 0 defects, both in the injury recordable bucket and the crash bucket. So I wanted to spend a minute and walk everybody through this process. And the takeaways from today's conversation are this. It's not necessarily the number of strokes that you perform. It's not necessarily how many employees that you're looking at. It's not necessarily whether you offer a reward or a consequence. If you want to have a successful behavior-based safety program, you need to take out all of those things or make them secondary, and understanding the motivation or drive behind each employee. Provide a coaching experience where the employee actually walks away understanding why the improved behavior is going to benefit them. And you can do that by understanding one of their 9 particular drives. If you incorporate that at a large level and spend time with your teams walking them through how to conduct appropriate feedback, you're going to see some very positive outcomes. And I can tell you, for the 42,000 employees that I am personally responsible for, I should say it that way, that are in this work area, what we see is when we put an emphasis on appropriate feedback, adding the magic to the feedback, we've seen appropriate reductions with integrity. In other words, we report everything that we've instructed our folks to report, everything that occurs, and really focus on what the root cause associated with. And I will tell you this, if you're the type of employer that tends to focus on what Hendrik was looking at with people failures, I can assure you, you're going to have many sleepless nights. You're going to be scratching your head wondering why you can't move people to a safer outlook versus those folks that continue to have issues. And I would challenge you, before you start with the employee, start with your management team. They're good people. They just need proper direction, proper coaching, proper counseling, and they need to have the environment where defects are okay, not in the sense that we're hurting people, but in the sense that those are opportunities to study them for root causes and develop and modify your systems so you can apply that to your workforce. So Larry and team, that is our overview of behavior-based safety. I appreciate everybody giving me the opportunity to walk them through this process. I can tell you there's a lot of excellent research out there. For those folks that like to do some of that, I would encourage you to look at some of the leading folks. Dr. David Forbes is outstanding. Dr. Demick is another one that's outstanding. If you look at Adam Grant's doing some excellent work. Angela Duckworth, she's really doing leading edge work on intrinsic motivation. So there's a lot of data and research out there to support this. So when you go back to your operations management teams and you start pitching this, it's not just some person that gave you a presentation on a Monday, but there's real empirical science. And I will tell you this, the most important thing to any successful safety program is your people. And the last thing you want to do is alienate your people. Rather, you want to partner with your people, elevate their improvements, highlight them, offer appropriate rewards for that. And when you go through progressive remediation, it needs to be just that, progressive. Patience and persistence will take you where you want to go. So with that, Larry, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Fantastic, Richard. I like some of the things that you highlighted and stressed, one of them being proper training on how to do observations. And I don't think people understand the quality of training that needs to occur. And you pointed it out with these 9 things. What I hear quite often is, hey, go out there and do an observation on Larry and tell him what he's doing right or wrong. Well, when you do that, does the observer really know about these 9 things? Do they know at what point Larry is in his career, where he's at in life, where does he fit into these 9 things? And we teach all the time that the supervisor giving feedback, the manager giving feedback needs to know their people. Because if they're an introvert, an extrovert, how you give feedback is going to differ by person. So doing the quality training and getting people to understand that it's just not a one size fits all feedback thing. Hey, Larry, you did a great job. That doesn't tell them anything, but knowing their people and how to motivate their people is a very important part of it. It's an important part of the whole entire feedback process. And it's a lot more complicated than most of us thought. So excellent presentation on getting us to think about how we do our training, how detailed our training needs to be. I think that's going to go a long way, Richard. So with that, we'll open it up to some questions. See if I can get down here. Anybody have any questions for Richard or for the officers? Anything about behavior-based safety?
Larry, it's Robert. Can we get a copy of the slide deck if possible?
Yes, it will be posted to our ASSP webpage. Usually takes me a day to get it up there. If you send me an email, I will send you a PDF version of it. And also the recording will be available on our webpage.
Thank you so much.
Other questions? If not, Richard, thank you so much for your presentation today. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining the meeting today. We had quite a few new guests. So we're looking forward to you guys being members and attend meetings in the future, both in Austin and the San Antonio areas. So with that, we will end today's meeting. Thank you.